Hi, I'm Josh Abbott, and I'll be presenting joint work done with Charles Kemp at the University of Melbourne. Our paper is titled Birds and Words, Exploring Environmental Influences on Folk Categorization. So a fundamental question driving cognitive science research is why do people divide entities in the world into the categories that they do? There have been many different approaches to studying this question. For example, early cognitive psychologists were interested in how people, in the lab, learned to classify and reason with artificial categories like shapes and dot patterns. At the same time, cognitive anthropologists studied categorization across the world's cultures in domains like plants and animals, and color and kinship. More recently, there's lots of interdisciplinary work across fields combining these ideas and focusing on the question of how the structure of the environment influences categorization using natural categories. One of the findings out of this line of research is that people across cultures tend to group plants and animals into hierarchies or taxonomies with these different levels or ranks of inclusivity. So in this example, this bird is grouped into levels of animal at the folk kingdom level, bird at life form, eagle at folk generic, and bald eagle at the folk specific level. So another theme in this research is that folk taxonomies often align well with Western scientific taxonomies. This might suggest that folk taxonomies are shaped more by environmental structure than by the idiosyncratic needs and concerns of a particular culture. But not always. There are cultures that categorize animals based off cross life form group features, such as things that are nocturnal, or flies high in the air. They do not align well with these Western scientific taxonomies. So these results have brought upon a long debate about folk classification between the intellectualist and utilitarian views. So the intellectualist view holds that named categories reflect fundamental biological discontinuities that are perceptually salient. The utilitarian view emphasizes ways in which categories are useful for a given culture. And as just described, the evidence is mixed between these two views. So much of the cognitively oriented work on folk biology took place last century. And in recent years, there's been new large-scale digital data sets that have made it possible to characterize the structure of the environment in ways that were previously very difficult or impossible. So here we're going to draw on these resources to revisit this classic question of the relationship between named categories and the environment. This is going to allow us to give a more careful, controlled, and quantitative analysis of complex real-world natural categories. In particular, we're going to focus on the natural categories of birds. Here we can begin by compiling properties of a bird species in a given area, such as how big is it or how often is it observed. And from there, we can study how these properties relate to named categories in the local language. So in particular, we investigate how the frequency of observation of a species in an area influences the categorization system of that local culture. So for example, depending on where you live, you may see lots of these black-colored kinds of birds all around you every day, while only seeing this other bird on the right, say, once or twice in a lifetime. So we can ask questions such as, does frequency of a species influence whether the species is named, or does frequency influence the form of the name for that species? And the effects of frequency on categorization have been previously studied in psychology. So for example, Verducci found that categories tended to be broad in low frequency regions of stimulus space, but narrow in regions with frequently encountered stimuli. So from this, we might predict that bird species encountered frequently are more likely to be assigned their own distinctive categories. Frequency also connects back with this debate between the intellectualist and utilitarian. So recall that the intellectualist view proposes named categories reflect fundamental biological discontinuities that are perceptually salient. So this view assigns a minimal role to frequency. The utilitarian view emphasizes ways in which categories are useful for a given culture. So it naturally accommodates frequency effects because assigning a label to a category is especially worthwhile if there are many occasions to use it. So now that we have these new digital data sets, we can revisit the same complex questions that cognitive anthropologists have asked for with a more quantitative and computational lens. It's going to be able to characterize the structure of the environment. So now turn to the questions and predictions that we make regarding frequency's effects on categorization, following two broad themes about category extensions and category labels. First, we focus on category extensions and ask, does frequency of a species influence whether the species is named? And we're going to hypothesize that it will. Then we consider how frequency affects the number of other members in a named category. We're going to predict that more frequently encountered species will tend to be in smaller size categories. The second set of questions concerns how frequency affects lexical properties of category labels. We consider if it predicts the relative lengths of category names, which we're going to hypothesize that The more frequent species will have shorter names. And finally, we'll consider frequency of a species predicts whether the name is an unmarked prototype, which we predict it will. So with these questions in mind, well, now we need these data sets that provide us with a folk taxonomy of birds in a particular area, along with frequencies of birds in that area. So our naming data are based on a detailed folk taxonomy of the Zapotec language provided by Eugene Hunn's book from 2008. This was based on his fieldwork in San Juan Gabi, a village in the Sierra Sur of Oaxaca, Mexico. The taxonomy of Zapotec bird naming follows a similar hierarchical structure of life forms, where, for example, there's a one-to-one correspondence for the Zapotec folk generic name for heron and the cattle egret species. Hummingbirds, however, have one folk generic word used to label 14 local species. There are additional folk-specific categories in Zapotec which distinguish the group further. So the Mexican violet ear has an additional modifier in its Zapotec name to reflect it's from the mountain regions, while the dusky hummingbird up top here is not distinguished from its folk generic name. Now, our frequency data are drawn from eBird, which is a citizen science-based bird observation network managed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The eBird data are contributed by birders, both professional and amateur, who use the site and mobile app to record the time and place of bird settings. And we've used recorded bird species from just the region containing the state of Oaxaca and Mexico. Now, beyond frequency, it's plausible that physical and behavioral characteristics of birds both influence folk categorization. So Hunn in 1999 documented that smaller species are more likely to be lumped together into large categories, and that larger species are more likely to be given distinct names. So following his lead, we're going to also evaluate bird size as an influence on categorization and use mass sourced from Dunning Jr. Now that we have data, we start by asking how frequency of observation affects the extensions of categories, and in particular, if frequency influences whether or not a species is named. So this violin plot shows the distribution of bird frequencies in Oaxaca, where we see there's a full range of frequent and infrequent bird species. Now, most descriptions of folk taxonomies do not systematically describe species found in the local area that are not named by the local residents. So our eBird data, however, includes species that were documented in Oaxaca, but not included in Hunn's taxonomy. So we can plot the distribution of frequencies of this missing data as well. And we can see the missing data is quite similar to the distribution for all of Oaxaca, which is good. Because now our question becomes, what does a distribution of Zapotec named birds look like? If it's the case that frequent species are more likely to be named, we should see most of its mass in the upper left, which we do. So here we see the distribution for Zapotec named species tends to be the most frequently observed species in the area. And when we look at the naming data in relation to body mass, however, we find all the distributions are similar. So body mass is not a great predictor of whether or not a species is named. But our intuition was correct in this case. Frequent species are more likely to be named. So next we explore how named species are organized into categories. And we're going to particularly look at whether the frequency and mass of a species predicts the number of other species it's grouped with at the folk generic level. So following prior work on frequency effects, we hypothesized that frequent species would tend to be grouped with fewer others because investing in a distinctive name for a species makes most sense if there are lots of occasions to use it. We also expected to replicate the work of Hunn from '99, who reported that larger species tend to be grouped with fewer others, which makes sense given that larger species are especially salient perceptually. So the category size of each species is defined as the total size of the folk generic category to which it belongs. For example, there are 14 hummingbirds at the folk generic level in Zapotec, and for each species receives a category size of 14. And here's a plot of category size against frequency, where you can see the 14 hummingbird points at the top. But we see that frequency has only a weak effect, if any, on category size. However, mass has a much stronger effect. These results support Hunn's finding that larger species tend to be assigned to smaller categories, but suggests that frequency predicts category size only weakly. So while this prediction turned out to be false, however, we did not include a third environmental factor which probably interacts with body mass and frequency. The category size of a species probably depends on how many other similar species are found in the environment. For example, one reason why hummingbirds are the largest folk generic category in our data is that Oaxaca has many species of hummingbirds that look relatively similar to each other and relatively distinct from other species in the environment. We now turn to the broad question of how frequency influences particular lexical properties of category labels, beginning with name length. So Zipf's law of brevity is the well-established regularity that word lengths are inversely related to word frequency. And intuition suggests that the frequency with which a species is named might roughly track the frequency with which it's observed. So we hypothesize that more frequent species would tend to have shorter names. Here we see, however, birds with longer names had a slight tendency to be more frequent, while mass influences name length in the opposite direction. However, neither variable is a strong predictor of name length. Why is this the case? Well, two explanations seem plausible. Consistent with Zipf's law of brevity, it's possible that frequently used names do tend to be short, but perhaps these names do not pick out the species that are observed most frequently. So commonly discussed species may include cases such as the bald eagle in American culture that has cultural significance, even though they're observed pretty rarely. And a second possible explanation is that the effective frequency is again dominated by perceptual similarity. So it is not the case that frequent species have shorter names. So we'll now explore another lexical property, asking if frequency influences whether a label is an unmarked prototype. If some vultures, like this turkey vulture on the left, are simply called the folk generic name for vulture at the folk specific level, but others have a compound name, such as the black vulture, then vultures with a monomial name might be expected to be more typical than those given a distinctive folk specific name. Several factors could contribute to typicality. For example, typical birds could be those encountered most frequently, or those that are perceptually most representative of the folk generic category. So here we're going to test the hypothesis that frequency predicts whether a bird is an unmarked prototype. And here we see that the unmarked prototype for vulture is also the most frequently observed of all the vultures. And this trend holds across 5 of the 6 cases of prototypes in our data, with a notable exception for the folk generic category, including owls. So although the counts for this category are comparatively low, the unmarked prototype is the great horned owl. It's only the second most frequently owl in eBird data. So Hun actually noted that the great horned owl is considered an ill omen by many, and the cultural salience of this species may therefore explain why it receives an unmarked prototype name despite being infrequently observed. However, overall, these results suggest that Zapotec unmarked prototypes can be predicted by frequency of observation. So in summary, we drew on new large-scale digital data sets to ask whether frequency of occurrence predicts how a species is classified in a Zapotec folk taxonomy. Our first set of analyses on category extensions found that frequency predicts whether or not a species is named, but that frequency only weakly predicts category size, whereas mass was a strong predictor. Our second set of analyses focus on category names, although our results suggest that frequency influences some aspects of naming, such as whether the folk-specific name for a species is an unmarked prototype. To our surprise, we found that frequency did not predict the length of a species' name. Again, a possible explanation is the effect of frequency is dominated by perceptual similarity. So while our results are mixed, some of these assumptions are worth exploring even further. So for example, in hypothesis 3, we made the assumption that more frequently observed species correspond to more frequently named species, and thus by Zipf should have shorter labels. But this isn't necessarily the case, and we're interested in further exploring these interactions between the frequency of observation of a bird and the term used to describe it. So in future work, we plan to do more fine-grained analyses. We're going to combine frequency data with a perceptual similarity space, and we'll explore this interaction in shaping folk classification. And we're expanding this approach to more languages and folk taxonomies in different geographic regions of the world. So while our analyses have been rather simple, we see them as initial steps in a research program that combines large-scale environmental data and folk taxonomies to yield new insight into categorization and naming across cultures. So thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email us. If you'd like to play with any of the analysis code and data, please visit our GitHub site. Thanks.